Based on ethnographic research in Marseille, which includes participant observation with Muslim undertakers and female corpse washers, this talk examines how bereaved Muslim families, Muslim funeral homes, and the French Council for the Muslim Religion, hence after CFCM, are adapting and reacting to new French government health regulations, especially those banning the ritual washing and deshrouding of the corpse. I consider that these reactions are not ephemeral and transient, but rather enduring responses to upheavals caused by the COVID pandemic and the new health regulations, both at the level of funeral home practices and family responses. From my point of view, they open up in new ways of enacting funeral rites and death. France is home to the largest number of Muslims in Western Europe. About 5.7 million Muslims live in France, comprising 8.8% of its total population. There are 67 million inhabitants in France. 75% of these Muslims have ancestral connections to the countries of the Maghreb, Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, which were French colonies. According to the French Ministry of Interior, around 75% of these Muslims are repatriated to be buried in their country of origin. In the particular case of the Muslims of Marseille, who constitute 25% of the city's population, there are 1 million inhabitants in Marseille. It is estimated that 80 to 80% of them are repatriated to be buried in their country of origin. However, the outbreak of the COVID pandemic in early 2020 had a big impact on the feasibility of a cross-border corpse repatriation. In February 2020, due to the coronavirus outbreak and possibilities of contagion, the French health authorities banned any form of mortuary toilet, ritual or not, in all French public hospitals. In March 2020, the French government imposed a total lockdown that lasted from March 17 until May 11th. France closed its borders, international travel came to a standstill, and many countries issued a moratorium on cross-border corpse repatriation, such as Morocco and Algeria. The COVID pandemic exposed the importance of the care of the corpse and showed how banning the mortuary toilet led Muslim funeral homes to enact death and Islamic funerary rites in different new ways. In what follows, I will first introduce Islamic funerary rites in general, then I discuss how they were enacted among French Muslims in Marseille before and during the COVID pandemic, focusing on the different reactions of Muslim undertakers, bereaved Muslim families, and the CFCM to new health regulations. As the sociologist Patrick Baudry points out, quote, there is no society without a funerary ritual. Its universality is undoubtedly one of its primary features. No society gets rid of the dead body as if it had no importance from the moment it no longer lives. End quote. Taking care of the corpse is mandatory for Muslims. The washing and the shrouding of the dead body are central aspects of Islamic funerary rites and are considered as respect and honor of the dead. Islamic funerary rites are considered a responsibility of the Muslim community, and they consist of 3 phases: the washing and the shrouding of the deceased, the funeral prayer, and the burial. Cremation is forbidden in Islam. Once death is evident, these rites have to be performed as soon as possible, as the Prophet Muhammad said, quote, hasten the funeral rites, end quote. This prophetic tradition is echoed in the widespread Muslim saying of honoring the deceased is burying him. The purpose of washing the corpse in Islam is to clean and honor the dead. It is preferable that the deceased's immediate family members or relatives perform the ritual washing and shrouding of the corpse. However, the general rule is that males should wash males and females should wash females, except for children up to the age of 8. The deceased can also be washed by his or her spouse. The ritual washing and shrouding takes about an hour, and there is a need for 2 persons and more, depending on the weight of the corpse. The body is washed with warm water an odd number of times, 3, 5, or 7, starting on the right side, from front to the back, and from the head to toe. Muslim corpse washers believe that the deceased feels and hears during the care process. Upon completing the ritual washing and shrouding, they stand next to the deceased head, place their hand on the deceased's shoulder, and ask for forgiveness in case they have hurt him or her during the washing and shrouding. Islamic funerary rituals have a deep meaning and value for Muslims, and they have become a cultural activity in Muslim societies and in Muslim communities in diaspora. Whenever I get a phone call from a Muslim bereaved family seeking services from my funeral home, the first question they ask me is, when is the ritual mortuary toilet going to take place? The most important thing for them is the mortuary toilet. All they think about is the mortuary toilet. Many of Française Muslims, including those who wish to be buried locally, as well as those who wish to be repatriated, have burial insurance at one of the city's Muslim funeral homes. In the case of local burial, as in that of repatriation, the burial insurance contract covers the transfer of the dead to the morgue, the ritual washing and shrouding, the coffin, and the transfer of the body to the cemetery, either in France or in the country of origin. In case of repatriation, the funeral home also pays for a plane ticket for a family member to accompany the body to its final destination. The administrative procedures are carried out by the funeral home, and the body is buried relatively quickly in the event of local burial, and it could be repatriated in a day or 2. After the ritual washing and the shrouding, which takes place in the mortuary chamber of the morgue, the body is placed in a coffin and taken to a nearby hall for a ceremony and a funeral prayer in the presence of family and friends. After the ceremony, the undertaker closes the coffin and transfers it either to a French cemetery in the event of local burial or to the airport in the case of repatriation. In her study of immigrant graves and the funerals in Sweden, Eva Remers demonstrates that people employ rituals to demonstrate where they belong and who they are. And according to Driver, to ritualize is to make oneself present. This context helps us understand why the bereaved Muslim families in Marseille accord an utmost importance to the ritual mortuary toilet mentioned earlier. Caring for the corpse by washing and shrouding it helps these families demonstrate who they are and to what culture they belong. They are Muslims of France, and they want to practice their religious and cultural funerary rites, which help them assert their presence in French society. The COVID pandemic transformed Islamic funerary rites as well as the practice of repatriating bodies as new health regulations and the travel restrictions were put in place. On March 17, 2020, France closed its borders and placed its population under a total lockdown, which lasted until May 11th. The French health authorities banned all kinds of mortuary toilet, ritual or not, due to the possibilities of contagion. Accordingly, closing the mouth and eyes of the deceased and washing and shrouding the corpse were all forbidden. The bereaved Muslim families had to face the harsh reality of not being able to perform the ritual mortuary toilet, which prevented them from seeing, touching, and kissing their dead. The repatriation of bodies stopped with the start of the confinement, and the corpses of Muslims had to be buried locally in French cemeteries. Between March 17 and April 2020, the bodies of those who died of COVID were taken care of by Muslim undertakers at the morgue. Since the ritual washing and shrouding were prohibited, the body was placed in a hermetically sealed and metal-lined casket, cercueil hermétique, and taken directly to the cemetery for burial in the presence of a limited number of family members, about 6 people, who could not see nor touch the deceased because the coffin was sealed. The bodies of those who had not died from the coronavirus could not be washed in a mortuary room in public hospitals, as the mortuary toilet was prohibited regardless of the cause of death in public hospitals. Therefore, Muslim undertakers had to find a private morgue where they could transfer the body, perform the ritual washing and shrouding, and conduct a funeral ceremony with a limited number of family members, keeping a social distance of 1 meter. Thus, the bereaved family could see the corpse, but not touch it. Muslim bereaved families struggled financially as they had to pay for the private morgue and for a burial plot. The family also struggled psychologically as they could not fulfill their deceased last wish to be repatriated to the country of origin. In addition, these families have expressed a strong desire to exhume their deceased and repatriate their remains when circumstances permit. The growing number of Muslim dead exposed a long-standing problem in France, namely the scarcity of Islamic burial grounds in French cemeteries. Among the 35,000 French cemeteries, only about 600 have places dedicated to Muslims. While 25% of the population of the city of Marseille is Muslim, only 2 cemeteries out of 21 in the city have an Islamic section, and both of them have been at full capacity since the beginning of the COVID pandemic. In my opinion, it is this harsh reality of banning body repatriation, banning the ritual washing and shrouding, the shortage of Islamic burial grounds in French cemeteries, and most importantly, the urgency to comfort the bereaved Muslim families that led the CFCM to declare Muslims who died of the coronavirus as martyrs, shaheed in Arabic. In Islam, martyrs must be buried without being washed, nor shrouded, or having a funeral prayer organized for them. Can I have a sip of water? Thank you. Okay. In a press release dated to 27 March 2020, the CFCM specifies, quote, "It is useful to remember that those who died during a pandemic are elevated to the rank of martyrs, and that even if they do not have the status of war martyrs, they are victims of a war against the epidemic. The term martyr can have both religious and non-religious connotations, and it is used to describe those who died for non-religious ideological causes. According to a prophetic tradition, there are at least 5 different types of martyrs. 5 are considered martyrs. These are those who die from plague, abdominal disease, drowning, or collapsing building, and martyrs for the cause of God or Allah. It is important to point out here that the CFCM used a similar martial tone applied by President Macron 10 days earlier. On March 16, 2020, during his 21-minute televised speech, President Macron repeated the phrase, "We are at war, nous sommes en guerre," 6 times, calling for general mobilization against the virus, an invisible and elusive enemy. The CFCM used a similar tone, treating Muslims who died of the coronavirus as victims of a war against the pandemic and declared them as martyrs, shaheed in Arabic, a term which in the West is often associated with the notion of holy war, jihad, and terror. Understanding the importance of the mortuary toilet for the living would further enhance our understanding of the CFCM decision of considering Muslims who died of COVID as martyrs. The works of major sociologists and anthropologists in the field of death, ritual, and belief illuminate the nature of mortuary ritual as behavior assisting the living through the stress of death. In his book entitled Death, Ritual, and Belief, Douglas Davis argues that the mortuary ritual is the human adaptive response to death. Ritual contributes not only in coping with death, but even in triumphing over it. And the funerary rites foster a commitment to life despite the fact of death. Mr. Heusch, undertaker and corpse washer, describes the impact of the cleansed corpse on Muslim bereaved families as follows. The purified and perfumed dead body helps Muslim bereaved families to accept death. It is therapy for them. There is a huge difference between the body before washing it and after it. In his 2003 final seminar, Jacques Derrida deals with the question of the alternative between burial and cremation. He considers these two possibilities in relation to both time and space. He explains that burial assures the corpse a bit more time either on earth or in it. With respect to space, inhumation provides a specific site for mourning or memory, a tomb or a grave where family and survivors can gather to pray or pay their respect. In the case of the Muslim who had died during the lockdown, the corpse was deprived of the time and the space Derrida talks about. With regards to time, the Muslim body did not have the time for ritual washing, perfuming, shrouding, which prevented the family from having the last opportunity to see the body, touch it, kiss it, nor feel its materiality. As for the space, cemeteries were closed during the lockdown and survivors and loved ones were not allowed to attend the burial of their deceased. It was even impossible for them to see the tomb nor gather around it to pray or pay their respect. In this respect, I believe that the main reason behind the CFCM decision to revert to those who died of COVID-19 as martyrs is to comfort the survivors. All of this shows how the pandemic emphasized the importance and significance of the care of the corpse for bereaved families and the big impact banning it could have on the living or survivors. In April 2020, the repatriation of the bodies of those who did not die of COVID to Algeria resumed. The repatriation took place twice a week from Lyon and Paris via cargo flights. In August 2020, repatriating bodies of those who died of COVID became possible. As of last month, March 2022, the repatriation of bodies to Algeria and Tunisia, regardless of the case of death, takes place via cargo flights 3 times a week from Lyon and Paris, and at least once a week from Marseille. Morocco still does not allow repatriating the bodies of those who died of COVID. As for the ritual mortuary toilet, it can be performed on the bodies of those who had not died of COVID, but not on those who died of COVID. However, Muslim undertakers and corpse washer can perform tayammum, dry toilet, on those who died of the coronavirus. One corpse washer described to me how he performs tayammum on a deceased who had died of COVID as follows. I usually arrive to the morgue and find the corpse in a body bag. If the hospital authorizes me to open the bag, I do so. Then I say the basmala in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. I pass my hands over the stone I brought with me, and then I pass my hands only once over the right hand, left hand, and the face of the deceased. Then I say the Shahada, the basic creed. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his messenger. And they close the bag, the body bag. Then I shroud this bag containing the body, place it in the coffin, close and seal the coffin. After this act, the body is either taken to a cemetery and buried locally or repatriated to the country of origin of the deceased. The body is repatriated alone via a cargo flight. As a result, Muslim bereaved families suffer psychologically as they are not able to mourn properly. 1 minute, 1 second. It is almost 2 years after the end of the first confinement, and the funeral practices of Muslims of France remain deeply affected by the reactions and measures taken by French institutions to fight against the pandemic. Funeral directors try to adapt to new reality and finding new techniques such as dry toilet, replacing the classical mortuary toilet, shrouding the plastic bag containing the dead body, and repatriation bodies via cargo flights instead of passenger flights. Bereaved Muslim families have to grieve in deeply upset conditions. The attempt to requalify those who died of COVID as martyrs is certainly very honorable on the part of the FCM, but it remains in the order of speech. As performative as this may be, this qualification cannot compensate for all the profound upheavals faced, nor the challenges they raise. The rearrangements of funeral practices within the framework of measures to combat the pandemic have therefore opened up transformations in practices which need to be further studied and whose further repercussions may not yet be felt. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yumna. You hold the panel 2 minutes to ask questions. Now we're going to move to Bolton and Catriona Jarvis. Steve and Catriona are co-governor and founder of the Last Point Project and director of Notoria. Steve Bolton is a lawyer, goes on practicing, specializing in children's rights, refugee and human rights, whereas Catriona is a former judge in the United Kingdom, and they're going to talk today about death, what it drives, rituality, its economics, and politics. The floor is yours. 20 minutes.
It's running. Thank you very much, Nada, and thank you very much to the organizers for inviting us to share in this remarkable 3 days of discussion with you as academics. We are not academics. We are lawyers by profession who've ended up as legal activists, I suppose, and in some ways by accident. After finishing our practices and retiring from court, we went to Greece in 2015 at the, I suppose, the peak of the crisis for refugees coming to Lesbos. And before that, before we arrived, one of the things that happened was a multiple fatalities, shipwreck that led to a chronic lack of capacity in the local morgue on Lesbos, and Catriona decided we couldn't stand back and do nothing, so we intervened to organize an emergency mobile morgue to be sent to the island so that the bodies could at least rest with some dignity whilst the forensic process of identification and location of families, etc., could be conducted. And as a result of that, we developed quite a close relationship with Lesbos and many of the activists and organizations working there. I haven't got a PowerPoint presentation today. I usually show some photographs, but we haven't because of COVID got any contemporaneous photographs, and I don't want to show historical photographs out of context, but I thought it might be useful instead just to show you our flag, as we were talking, and Federica was talking yesterday about the semiotics of life jackets. The flag is made from the life jackets and death jackets retrieved on Lesbos to represent and show solidarity with families of deceased migrants and those who've gone missing. And we use it where we speak, and we use it when we travel, and it's accompanied us on protests and demonstrations, vigils, and memorials. So I'm very happy that we're able to share that with you here. We were invited to talk, and our abstract does indeed talk about economics and the administration and politics of contemporary rituality. In fact, we wrote that abstract before the panels were drawn up, and we were asked to talk about COVID. So it's slightly different in that last year we produced a report called Everybody Counts, which was an attempt very quickly at the height of the pandemic in various places to get a snapshot and some kind of understanding about what was going on at the time. It certainly doesn't pretend to be a rigorous piece of academic research, but it wouldn't have been possible in that time frame. COVID profoundly affected the whole world, of course, and it's still raging and still killing thousands, even if some Western countries would prefer to pretend it has already ended. It was initially said that it doesn't discriminate as a disease, but the responses of states to it are unsurprisingly discriminatory and unsurprisingly prejudicial to the lives of migrants in particular. Those who are already on the margins of society are also on the margins of healthcare and the margins of death and the rituals that traditionally and necessarily accompany death. In January 2021, when we produced the report, we felt, as I said, it was already heavily compromised from the very start because of the stringent lockdown measures. But the work that we managed to carry out highlighted some of the immediate and deeply concerning problems faced by bereaved families, and indeed the fears of the living about what would befall themselves in death as migrants, distant from their original homes and families, and in many cases dislocated from the traditional rituals of mourning and last rites, alienated from processes of truth and justice, and abandoned to their fates in detention centres and camps, not to mention opportunistic states who, with the attention of the media and populations at large, distracted by their own existential concerns, hardened their border policies, increased pushbacks at sea and on land crossings, imposed overly strict and still enduring lockdown measures way beyond other parts of civil society, and left migrant communities at the back of the queue for vaccinations and access to urgent and non-urgent healthcare. So, living an already liminal existence outside the usual civic society, migrants faced a further invisibility, further prejudice, further obstacles in their daily lives, and they still face these problems, whilst we are coming out in some places completely free from restrictions. New arrivals are still being placed in lengthy quarantine conditions, often effectively in solitary confinement, facing restrictions of liberty far in excess of mainstream populations, and denied the lawful opportunities to travel, even when it's possible to get visas because of expensive testing and additional bureaucracies over and above the ordinary. Whilst all of us are familiar with these measures, and we all have our own family experiences to a greater or lesser extent during this pandemic, these are amplified tremendously for migrants. Time prevents a comprehensive look at our report, but I'll highlight several issues that came up repeatedly in interviews with family associations, community groups, and people working on the front lines with migrant families who experienced loss during the pandemic. Our project is immensely grateful to the researchers who so quickly took up the task of compiling these remote reports remotely and by desk work. Filippo Furi, B. Abbott, Danai Angeli, and Lorena Nunes Carrasco. We looked at the European context, Greece, Germany, Italy, France, and also South Africa and Zimbabwe, the USA and Mexico. But as I say, these are really only snapshots. Whilst it was no more than that, it nevertheless gave some instant insight into these experiences and the major concerns of migrant families, and it enabled us to compile over 100 recommendations that we were able to put at an international level through UN organs and other international non-governmental organizations who we work with, as well as to individual states. In New York, one of the worst hit areas of the city, and indeed the whole of the USA, was ironically the Corona district of Queens, a densely populated neighborhood with a large migrant community, mostly of Mexican, or many rather, of Mexican origin. It was described at one point as the epicenter of the pandemic in New York. And within that district, Mexican migrant families suffered badly in so many respects, not least in terms of what appeared to be over 2,000 fatalities, exacerbated by high density dwellings and dangerously exposed working conditions in often unprotected environments for many migrant workers. As our researchers were told in the first few weeks of the pandemic, there were no testing sites locally, no official information in Spanish, and misinformation about the virus was as rife as the virus itself. In short, there was a complete lack of response to the Mexican community of Corona in Queens at any level, including by the Mexican consulate and its services itself. Migrants, particularly the undocumented, typically didn't qualify for state and federal relief in the form of unemployment benefits. Many feared in any event that revealing themselves to the authorities would mean that they would be exposed to deportation, and they simply could not afford to stop work, however dangerous those conditions were. Eventually, some assistance was provided through the New York City emergency funds, including a burial assistance fund, which the city authorities modified to include support regardless of immigration status eventually. But this was far too late and too little for too many. People were too afraid to visit hospital, either for themselves or to look for loved ones. They couldn't afford treatment, nor the medical insurance to cover it. Even though the costs of COVID-related treatment were not actually being charged, migrants themselves did not believe this and stayed at home. Many died at home as a result. There were also fears that because of a shortage of ventilators, Mexican families would be deprioritized and left to die. There's no evidence that this was true. Indeed, there are formal health service protocols for ventilator prioritization, which specifically excluded such considerations. But these kind of fears persisted nevertheless. The local hospital overflowed with bodies in makeshift morgues, and people feared that going into hospital would mean inevitable death. One of the biggest psychological deterrents to seeking treatment at hospital was the fear of the fossa commun, the communal grave. People told us that they didn't want to go to hospital because they had no one to collect their body if they died, and they would instead therefore be sent to the fossa commun that was being used on Hart Island. Hart Island is a long-standing New York paupers graveyard, a mass burial site dug by, amongst other people, convicts, and carries a lot of stigma and anxieties, not just for migrant communities. In fact, bodies are laid to rest in ways which can be located and individually identified and exhumed for relocation if requested. but the fears of an anonymous mass grave were overwhelming for many. They didn't fear death as such. Indeed, many assumed that they would die. It was what would happen to their body, which was the utmost concern. People were also highly fearful of being transferred from the local hospital to out-of-area hospitals and be lost to their relatives in this way. Some were not known by their actual names or were misnamed on admission, leading to people becoming lost to their relatives who were seeking them around hospitals. All this added to the fear that their bodies would be left in a state of limbo, of being unidentified, forgotten, lost, and most importantly, unable to be laid to rest in their homelands with their ancestors by the side of their relatives, with their relatives in their community, performing the last rites. In addition to these acute psychological fears, the economic reality for many migrants simply compounded those fears. The costs of obtaining the bodies of loved ones was complex, stressful, and expensive for families. Not being able to afford funeral insurance, large and sudden increases in funeral company charges, ineligibility for state funding, and the pressure to find money for funeral homes in very short timeframes because of a prescribed 14-day deadline to collect bodies due to the acute pressure on hospitals, mortuaries and funeral homes in terms of body storage, meant that the risk of bodies being sent to city burial or for cremation increased dramatically. And with so many deaths within the community in such a short period of time, this also stretched the migrant community itself and its ability to raise funds from within the community. Funeral costs had to be paid in full before a body could be picked up from the morgue, or in many cases, even before families were added to the waiting lists to have their loved ones collected. Prices rose from $1,600 to as much as $5,000 overnight in some cases. And during the peak of the pandemic, which was described by family associations as price gouging, some families reported being charged as much as $500 simply to open the coffin and confirm the identity of their loved ones. There's some example evidence that it wasn't just price gouging. There were additional health and safety measures that were had to be costed, and additional subcontracting costs because of the acute demand for services. But families also used GoFundMe applications online to help raise funds through a platform providing a digital obituary service that enabled lots of small donations towards funeral costs. For many others, it was a case of borrowing money and getting into larger amounts of debt to avoid their loved ones being sent to common burial and or cremation. Most families wanted to repatriate their loved ones' bodies to Mexico rather than their cremated remains. However, this became practically impossible during the peak of the 2020 pandemic period, essentially obliging families to cremate their loved ones against their wishes in order to have their remains returned home. The repatriation of a body was extremely complex, bureaucratically compared to pre-pandemic, and airlines offering such a service became prohibitively expensive. Consular services, Mexican consular services, were heavily criticized for being unresponsive and mysteriously absent when needed. People were unable to see their loved ones before cremation. Even where the body was returned, families were ordered not to open the body bag. And so this has been an extremely traumatizing thing for Mexican families and the whole community who are so used to holding a wake with the deceased present in order to say goodbye, and was profoundly painful for those families. Repatriation and burial rituals are of profound cultural significance, whether the family is religious or not. The feeling that people were being forced into choosing cremation and the difficulties in organizing transportation home, even of cremated remains, has caused deep and lasting upset amongst the community. At the time we wrote our report, there were around 2,000 deaths within the Mexican community of Queens, and an unknown number of those awaiting repatriation. The unfinished burial, mourning and grieving of the community is profound and largely exacerbated by inadequate information, overly bureaucratic procedures, inflated funeral home costs, and the emotional traumas forced upon migrant families during the pandemic. We also examined these aspects of the pandemic experience through the lens of what is for short called the Last Rites Mitalini Declaration, which part of it is on the screen behind me. This was a project that we initiated in 2018 on the island of Lesbos to bring together the many and very diffuse and diverse sets of rights long established in international human rights law that address issues of death and bereavement and loss. We brought together around 50 experts from a wide range of disciplines to discuss and draw up this declaration and a set of protocols that will eventually accompany it. And we use that as a tool to lobby and advocate with states to adopt a core set of basic principles essentially built around the concepts of dignity, truth and justice as set out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I don't have time to go through them here, but it essentially breaks down into the duties upon states and the rights of families in some detail. And we hope that over time, these will become incorporated into the policies and practice of states. I suppose we'll have to hope a long time. But in some ways, we were optimistic before the pandemic and the change of government in Greece that the Greek Human Rights Commission wholly adopted the Mitalini Declaration and sent, in effect, a memorandum to the government of Greece requiring it to operate within that set of standards, and so incorporating it effectively as soft jurisprudence into Greek law. We hope that other states will follow suit, but there is some evidence also that having consolidated these ideas into one place, it is picking up some kind of momentum across organizations at an international level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes. Okay, and now we're going to listen to Félicien. Am I pronouncing your Heusch? Who is a PhD candidate at the Center for African Migration Studies at the University of Liège. His PhD focuses on Senegalese migrants, transnational engagement around death, and he will be focusing today on the Senegalese community, but also in the context of school.
Thanks a lot. Let's see if that works this way. Okay, we are. Yeah. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be here today and meet finally in person several of you. The paper we present you today is part of the Migration, Transnationalism and Social Protection Project, which is an ERC project that looks at policies and practices shaping migrants' access to social protection in Europe. So this is a co-authored paper that we carried out with my colleagues Carole Wenger and Jean-Michel Lafleur, and it's currently under edition at the Remy Journal. So my colleague Carole and I actually united in this paper or respective thesis case study. So I'm working on the case of Senegal, Spain, and Belgium, and my colleague Carole is working. She's conducting a thesis on Tunisian migrants, transnational medical mobilities. So, well, I will move to the next slide. So actually the starting point of the reflection of this paper started well before the pandemic, when we had first discussions about diverging representations Senegalese and Tunisian migrants have towards their respective consular authorities. So as stated by the Senegalese migrants Facebook group, body repatriation is a real brain teaser, un vrai casse-tête for immigrants. The Tunisian state ensures free body repatriation for its children, while Senegalese state doesn't, but actually could do the same. So we will see now briefly why and how. So who takes care of the brain teaser? Well, there are several actors, as we've seen with the presentation of Yumna, presentation also of Linda yesterday, and the one of Valérie, involved around this key transnational practice, which involves a lot of challenge. But what I wanted to focus on now is that, for instance, the case of the private sector, such as insurance owned by local banks and insurance companies actually will offer repatriation products. But in this case of Senegalese migration in particular, there is a sort of general distrust, toward these initiatives. That is why, especially in France and Belgium, there are several funeral funds, so the Caisse des Morts, who usually takes care of body repatriation. But there are also spontaneous fundraising that are mobilized when necessary. So this is more the case of Finland, for instance, as Linda showed us yesterday. So in the Tunisian case, as far as I know, these funds do not exist. Why? Because the Tunisian state already takes care of this challenge, granting free body repatriation for its citizens abroad. Okay, so, and as Yumna showed us also, whether an actor or another involved on this issue, manipulation, thanatopraxis, and transport is carried out by funeral homes and airlines companies. So I will focus on the positions of the states of origin. So let's go to the next slide. So we wanted to look a bit at the legal aspects. Firstly, so we actually saw that there is free attention to repatriation by international law, either for the living or the dead. So there is a Vienna Convention that highlights that states are obliged to provide help and assistance to nationals abroad, which actually gives a very broad scope for interpretation and the floor to discretionary power. So there is no unconditional right to repatriation, but a tendency of support to the repatriation of the living through discretionary public intervention of consulates and foreign affairs ministries. So actually it is sort of practice that is, in the case of the repatriation of the living, has been highly mediatized by origin countries all over the world during the starting of the pandemic. So we wanted also to compare both cases of repatriation of the living and the dead. And then I focused with the I followed up, sorry, with the data on the debt. So generally, the assistance is conditional. Citizens abroad need to justify a sort of state of distress, or should repay the financial assistance of the repatriation. Some states also prefer to offer insurance mechanism through their consular network. So, in basis of the quantitative data collection that our colleagues carried on 12 non-EU countries, we designed this chart where you can see in blue the cases of Senegal and Tunisia, and of course some other interesting cases of engagement on body repatriation, such as the one of Sudan, Pakistan, and Mexico are also very important to take into account, but it's out of the scope of the paper today. So very briefly, on the left row, we can see states' positions for the repatriation for the living, and on the right row, states' positions toward the repatriation of the dead. In red, we can see cases where there is no public policy, in orange, discretionary basis, in light green, the obligation to repay, and in green, the right to repatriation, such as the interesting case of Tunisia. But it's important to mention that actually this data comes only from official sources of ministries, for instance, and consulates. So you will see then that in the case of Senegal, there is no assistance stated officially, but in practice, there is discretionary practice of support. Okay, so I will move then to the online and offline ethnography we conducted. So yeah, we had this idea to combine the quantitative data collected by my colleagues with our multi-site ethnography that we were conducting, my colleague and I, before the pandemic, and we just sort of readapted our methods with the reality of the pandemic. So during the first lockdown, the pandemic obliged us, as many of you also, to reinvent our methodologies and channels of communication. So this was also the case, of course, for research participants who were also under lockdown. But we observed that they particularly mobilized in social media, but also with high material implication in both countries of residence and origin. So there were several campaigns for sending healthcare material to Tunisia, Senegal, and two main campaigns that we looked around the fight for the right for body repatriation, when there was actually a ban in both cases of Tunisia and Senegal. So yeah, social media became then tool for protest against the prohibition of the return of the dead bodies to the ban who was stated by Tunisia and Senegal. And in the first step, so our ethnography turned virtual. So my colleague and I conducted a sort of ethnographic watch of this campaign, the very frequent numerous publications that were publicized every day on Facebook and so on and so forth. And we conducted first online interviews with key participants. After the first wave of the pandemic, we could carry on in-person interviews with state public officials and family members of COVID-19 deceased. So we decided to frame the engagement of the states toward their citizens abroad during the pandemic as a sort of double rejection of the bodies. So actually, this unique space-time of the pandemic gives us the opportunity to frame a bit this idea from the concept of the double absence of Sayad, that we then put also in tension with Duchois' idea of double presence. So actually, both double absence and double presence are continually negotiated, and Valérie also weekly showed us, for instance, that in the case of repatriation, deceased is always present for some persons, but absent at the same time for others. So the pandemic showed us also indeed, and on the one hand, a context of rejection of immigrants, whether living or dead, from the country of origin. The return of the living, for instance, was highly stigmatized. So there is always a historic associations between disease and migration since a long time ago, while also the return of the dead was compromised by states' interdictions, such as in the case of Tunisia and Senegal. On the other hand, we can see also with the work of Yumna that the immigrants dead and their families were facing the lack of Muslim plots in Europe and sometimes forced to be buried in undesirable conditions. Meanwhile, other campaigns were also calling, for instance, in France, to request the local authorities to create new plots. There was this campaign, Interpellez votre élu, for instance. So as you've seen, we had also this kind of stay home, save lives slogans targeting us and the living during the pandemic. But we wondered also somewhere what happened with the dead and body repatriation. So let's move to the case studies. So I will start with the Tunisian case. So in the case of, we wanted to compare what was the position of those two states before the pandemic and how this position somewhere was renegotiated during the pandemic. So body repatriation in Tunisia is an acquired right in decades. So as a matter of fact, there was a decree who was issued in the early 70s during Habib Bourguiba presidency, was considered as the father of the nation, taking in charge funeral homes' care of the body, the transport into the locality of origin, and the accompaniment by a family member on the flight. So this decree actually appeared in a particular context, who was the context of encouragement of labor immigration to Western Europe, and first early bilateral social security agreements with France and Belgium, for instance. There was also it was the climate of the creation of the Amicale, all tools actually who were aiming to bring the Tunisian abroad closer to consulates, so granting somewhere them social protection, but at the same time controlling also their activities abroad. So it is thus considered as a non-negotiable and acquired right by research participants, while the Tunisian states also, and however, decreased its support on body repatriation over the years. So now it's only the transport of the body which is carried on by the state, but not anymore the flight of the accompaniment and the transport until the locality of origin. So with the pandemic, the return of all Tunisian corpses back to Tunisia was initially refused by the state, with no distinction between COVID-19 death and normal deaths. So this is something different in the case of Senegal, as I will tell you then. So in the home countries, the population was afraid of being attacked by the bodies, while, for instance, in Italy, there were rumors circulating about the treatment of the bodies of Tunisians in these conditions of COVID-19, with the fear of cremation and burial in common graves. So that is why civil society attacked the consulates, following the words of the participants, and the origin state to assume its responsibility towards the right for body repatriation. So the state finally changed its practice after all of these mobilizations, taking in charge during the beginning of the pandemic, the burial fees in Europe through the consulate network. Afterwards, body repatriation recovered, but in the case of victims of COVID-19, it's only in November 2020 that the return was reauthorized. So in the case of Senegal, we have kind of a different picture, both before, during, and after the pandemic. So in difference with Tunisia, there is no decree or legal proof at all of any state support for body repatriation, but there are discretionary practices that are managed by consular and Ministry of Foreign Affairs public officers, both in the countries of residence or at the administration in Dakar, where I conducted part of my field work. So according to this, oh, it's moving. No, faster than me, sorry. So according to these officers, it's since Abdoulaye Wade presidency, so we are speaking about the 2000s, roughly, that a relief and assistance fund was implemented for Senegalese abroad facing hardships. Since then, the officers actually received daily demands from all over the world of deceased family members who are asking for support. But these officers actually support only some sensitive case, as they were telling me, such as the violent deaths that put into question actually state legitimacy. So we have cases of accidents, murders, and so on and so forth that I also focused on my research thesis. Okay, so generally also the president himself or the first lady support cases. So, but this engagement has limits, and the public officers, using a vocabulary coming from entrepreneurship, were nevertheless seeing their support as impossible to pursue in the future, considering that these demands are abuses, that the Senegalese state just can't afford it, and considering also the increasing Asian population abroad. So that's why the state is currently benchmarking, following the words, with banks and private insurance to propose a sort of consular package to its citizens abroad that would include body repatriation insurance, inscription to consular lists, and further other win-win initiatives of investment to the country of origin. So with the pandemic, there was a redefinition of engagement. So the Senegalese president first declared a ban of the COVID-19 corps only, not all the corpses, in difference with Tunisia. And then the state secretary of Senegalese abroad proposed to buy Muslim plots for burial in Europe. But it was actually more a performative statement than something really implemented. However, there was a special fund of around 12 million euros was launched for Senegalese abroad facing hardship. So it was the fourth diaspora COVID fund. Sorry. No, it goes much faster than it. With an envelope of around 2,000 euros for bereaved families of COVID-19. So for the diaspora, this initiative was nevertheless not making sense. Conversely, they wanted the state would give in with the ban. So that is why a unique collective, the CRC, Collectif pour le Rapatriement des Corps, with the lemma "Our bodies in our country," this unique collective was created by Senegalese doctors, COVID-19 families, members, and lawyers all over the world. They were fighting from the living room, but also introduced an application at the Supreme Court of Senegal. This request was rejected in the first instance, but then the president himself lifted the ban in an official declaration for all the emotional consequences that this unique campaign led. So, going to the conclusions, in light of the qualitative material I presented you today, we decided to use the moral economy approach that gives us some assets to understand the roles of values and representations shaping relationships between diaspora and origin states. So we try to frame in this manner two types of representation. So first, the perceived role that the state must fulfill. So as we have seen, Tunisia is perceived as a sort of interventionist state that developed early transnational support for its citizens abroad, such as its engagement for body repatriation. Conversely, Senegal is perceived by the diaspora as a sort of laissez-faire state that intervenes on a limited way to its diaspora. Second, the perceived role that the diaspora must fulfill. So Tunisian diaspora is expected to be loyal to the regime, despite the revolution put into question this requirement of loyalty, while Senegalese diaspora is encouraged for productive investment as a sort of money sender to Senegal. Also, the pandemic gave us an opportunity to observe relationships between states and diaspora, the crisis being barometers of this relationship. So the pandemic highlighted this way a turning point. The state was seen as defaulting by the diaspora. In the case of Tunisia, as we've seen, it was initially not fulfilling its engagement for body repatriation made by decree. The diaspora was then calling for the respect of the law, a re-interference of the state. In the case of Senegal, shows in the contrary that while the state was hindering families and associations' traditional management of body repatriation, they were calling for autonomy, a non-interference of the state. So for not being much more longer, I will just conclude with this. Thank you.